see, we got straight up 12 o'clock, but I know there's a lot of folks that still haven't got on, so we'll give them a minute or so before we get started.
Darren, I think I actually talked to you back in the spring about our property.
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
Good. Glad you could get on here today.
Yeah, we're still mulling it all over, so.
Sure. All right. Well, I got two after. I think we should go ahead and get started. I want to welcome you all to our webinar today to talk about conservation easements. This is kind of a 101 just to provide information regarding conservation easements, a general overview, and kind of process that a landowner would anticipate experiencing from start to finish. Obviously, very informal. Um, we will take questions as we go along. Feel free to ask them in the chat feature, and then some of the staff will answer them as we go, and then those that they don't, when we get done with our presentation, there should be plenty of time for questions and answers. Also, just as a reminder, we are recording this, so if you miss any part of it or some of the others that were unable to get on here, we'll also have opportunity to watch it later. To begin, I think let me introduce the staff that are presenting. So I'm Darren Clark. I'm the Director of Land Conservation with Texas Ag Land Trust. Also today have Andy James, who's a land transaction manager, and also Colin Walden, another land transaction manager. The three of us will be sharing information with you all today. And to avoid having to look at us the entire time, we did put together a PowerPoint. And I'm guessing when we get through, if anybody would like a copy of it, be more than happy to share that with you. So let me see if I can make this work. Um, let's see. Not exactly what I'm looking for. Let's try it this way. Okay.
Looks good on our end, Darren.
Okay. I was going to ask if somebody tell me. Perfect. So again, this is our basic conservation easement 101. One of the places to begin is to kind of talk a little bit about what the conservation easement is. And
Hey, we lost you, Darren. It stopped sharing.
figures.
There we go.
Okay. Let me all right, are the slide changing? Perfect. So I like to always start off presentations kind of with what the expectations are. And so for us, our expectations is to be able to provide you with information to give you a kind of a better understanding of what a conservation easement is, what it can do for you, kind of the process of what it takes from the beginning to the end, the different steps, the different types of conservation easements, and also to discuss some of the benefits. Um, feel like that is what we're trying to accomplish today to provide you. I know there's different levels of knowledge and experience when it comes to easements for y'all as participants, but hopefully give you enough information to help you with your decision making, determine if it's something that will help you with what you're trying to accomplish with your personal goals and objectives for your property. So to begin with, let's kind of talk about what a conservation easement is. And for a land trust, typically a landowner would reach out to a land trust as a deed holder. I can give you a list probably as long as your arm of different reasons why a landowner would be interested in a conservation easement. The main reason, obviously, is to protect the property, to protect it in perpetuity, which is a fancy word for forever. And to do that, landowner voluntarily reaches out to an eligible deed holder and works with that deed holder to prepare that conservation easement and do all the required steps in the process to be able to close that easement. And so typically a landowner might come to a land trust. A lot of times it's because of age. As you get towards the end of life, things start coming more real. And, you know, for some landowners, the concern is, well, I'm not going to live forever. What's going to happen to the property after I'm gone and not able to watch over it? Some of them may be health reasons. Some of them it may be for some life event that's fixing to happen. And so there are a lot of reasons for doing it, but the ultimate goal is to protect that property. Texas, unfortunately, is losing agriculture, wildlife land at a very rapid, very significant pace. The last data that we saw shows about 1,000, and if I remember right, 1,023 acres a day in Texas is being lost. And so for a landowner with that concern, conservation easement is a tool that will allow them the opportunity for protecting that property and keeping it as agriculture, open space wildlife in perpetuity. So when we talk about what a qualified easement holder is, you can see on the slide there are several types, but for us, you know, we fall in that first category. We are a nonprofit 501c3, as is most of the land trusts that currently operate in the state of Texas. You see the different responsibilities that the deed holder has. In addition to, you know, a nonprofit, units of government are also available, and there are a few others, but by far and wide, the most common is going to be your nonprofit 501c3. Oftentimes, the landowner will say, well, how do I find a conservation easement deed holder? And so over the years, we kind of direct them. When I mention that, it's from the perspective of, you know, this is a long-term relationship. You know, as I mentioned, they're perpetual easements. And so we like for a landowner to visit with at least two land trusts or two deed holders to find that good fit. And so what we do, one of the opportunities that's available, the Land Trust Alliance has this search feature on their website, and you can go in there, type in the location, whether it's a state or a region or maybe even county specific within a state, and you can go in there and type that in, and it will tell you all of the land trusts that operate within that geographic area. I think last I looked in Texas, there are 36 or 37 different land trusts that currently operate. Um, there are some similarities. There's also some differences. Each land trust is different in the sense that, you know, they have their own mission. They have their own focus on what they're trying to accomplish. And because of that, that's where you as a landowner will want to work with the land trust to determine if it's a good fit. Because depending on what you're trying to accomplish, you want to make sure that the land trust that you want to work with is also wanting to do the same thing and not having something possibly in their conservation easement deed that might be a conflict with what you're trying to accomplish. So this is a good source of information. If you go in there, incidentally, this is findalandtrust.org. And if you will go in there, it will bring up a list of them, and it has information that would be very useful in determining whether or not it might be a good fit. And then obviously you want to make that phone call and to visit with them and make that determination. So let's talk a little bit about what the conservation easement is. So first off, it is a real estate transaction. It is not a conveyance of fee title. The surface estate owner is still the landowner after the easement closes, but it is a real estate transaction because the landowner is voluntarily putting rights or restrictions on the property and giving up the development rights. The development right is the biggie. That's pretty much the purpose of the easement, is allowing the landowner to use the easement as a tool to maintain the property in agriculture, open space wildlife, and to prevent it from being developed. For us, each of our conservation easement deeds are different in the sense that we begin with a template. We have a conservation easement deed template that we have worked on, tailored, tweaked over the past 17 years. And we're really proud of the template that we have, but it's just that, it's a template, it's a starting point. And so as we work with the landowner, we're going to want to tailor that conservation easement deed to reflect the needs of both the property, but also for the goals and objectives that the landowner and their family have for protecting the property. And so because of that, no two easements are the same. Even what we would consider, and I hate to use the term, but even if it was one we would consider a rather simple conservation easement, by the time we're done, they still know there's no two that are the same. As I mentioned, it is a real estate transaction. It is a legal transaction. So when the easement is executed, when it's signed and executed, then it is filed at the county courthouse of record. It is legal under state law. And in addition to preventing the future development on the property, it also allows for the protection of the conservation values. And so as a land trust works with that landowner, part of that is to identify, well, what are the conservation values that are on the property or underneath the property that we're going to be protecting. And so the easement itself will serve as a tool to prevent the development, but also to protect those conservation values. As I mentioned, easements in Texas, for the most part, are perpetual. They are forever. State law allows that. Just kind of an FYI, there are states within the country that do not allow for perpetual easements. I think there are some that they look at a 30-year term as the longest that they will allow. But again, in Texas, perpetual easements. They do run with the land. So the landowner that encumbers the property with the conservation easement still has the right to convey ownership and fee title, whether that's through heirship to their kids, grandkids, or maybe just an outright selling of the property. They still have the right to do that. But the whole purpose of the easement, again, to protect the property in perpetuity, that easement is also going to be continued to be attached to the property. So it would give that landowner the peace of mind knowing that, you know, one day when that property changes hands, it's still going to be protected in perpetuity. I love this slide. I've used this example for many years, but it's a great visual. When you look at the rights that are held within the ownership of a property, think of them as a bundle of sticks. So in that bundle of sticks, every one of those sticks represents a right. Well, the first one, the biggest one, is going to be the development rights because that has the most value. But then when you start looking at, the right of access, the right to own it, the right to use it for recreation, the right to use it for agriculture, the right to use it for hunting, oil and gas, all of those are represented in that bundle of sticks. So when that conservation easement is executed and recorded, think of it as some of those sticks are being pulled from that bundle. So the landowner, the surface estate owner, is still going to retain the majority of those sticks. They're just taking a few of them out. And as I mentioned, the big one is the development rights. But then the other rights, maybe you as a landowner say, hey, I want to keep this property in its entirety. I don't want to allow for future divisions. Okay, well, that right is being pulled from that bundle of sticks. Landowner may say, hey, I want to be able to one day, build my dream home out there on the ranch. We've just never done it. Then we can use what's called a building envelope to allow that right for the surface estate owner to execute, and the property still, those acres still be part of the conservation easement. Again, that is a stick that's within that bundle. For simplicity, if you're at your desk, reach down, pick up a handful of pens and pencils, and it's the same thing, but it gives a good representation. It helps to understand what all is happening with that conservation easement and the rights to the property. Okay, so what does the easement actually do? For us, because in our name, agriculture is a part of it. This land trust began 17 years ago. It was started by the Texas Farm Bureau, the Texas Wildlife Association, and Texas Southwest Cattle Raisers Association. And so we are very agriculture minded, wildlife friendly. And because of that, our conservation easements are written in a manner that will allow the landowner to continue to produce an agriculture commodity as well as to manage the wildlife resource. And not only that, we encourage it, excuse me, because not only do we want to protect the land, but we also want to keep it used for agriculture. With our conservation easement deed, we do have flexibility. We understand that things change. It's not going to be the same forever. Technology changes, science changes, and so we allow for flexibility, particularly in the area of agriculture. Should some other opportunities arise somewhere down the road, the landowner would still have the opportunity to be able to make those changes, obviously provided they don't have a negative impact or conflict with what is in the conservation easement deed. I mentioned a while ago that new construction is allowed. We use what's called a building envelope. So if a landowner says, hey, got this great home site, we've just never built the home, but we'd like the right to one day, whether it's us or our kids, to be able to build a house out here. Then we'll put a building envelope. We identify that in our baseline data report, and that will keep those acres as part of the conservation easement, but it adds additional rights for the landowner or whoever the landowner is at that particular time that exercises the right, and they can construct a new home with whatever associated buildings are needed, as well as agriculture. Landowner might say, well, been needing a new hay barn. I want to put it on the back side of the ranch because we don't have one back there. It would be more convenient. Same situation. We can use a building envelope that would address that. There are other things that will come up. Again, we're agriculture minded. So as a landowner wants to apply conservation to the property, as long as the practice they're wanting to do is conservation minded, cross fencing, brush control, range seeding, maybe it's water improvements, livestock or wildlife. We allow for that. And by doing so, it not only protects the conservation values, but it also improves those conservation values. And so that's something that is written into our conservation easement. As I mentioned earlier, this is not a selling of the fee title. The surface estate owner still owns the property. It's just giving up some of the rights, some of those sticks out of that bundle. There is some misinformation out there. When a property is protected by a conservation easement, particularly one from a private land trust, a nonprofit land trust, that property does not become public access. It's not a park. It's not free for anybody to come out and access the property. For us, in our deed, it allows for TALT staff to come out once a year to do the monitoring, which we will talk about a little bit later. But beyond that, it's not a public access property. Secondly, we do not write anything into our conservation easement deed that addresses management. We feel like the landowner is the best steward of that property. So that is not our role, that is their role. And we don't put it in our deed. And when we come out to do the monitoring, that is not something we're looking at. We're just looking to make sure that what the landowner that encumbered the property with the conservation easement, that those restrictions are being followed. But beyond that, we don't do anything with management. I get asked the question quite frequently, if I have a conservation easement on my property, does that make it immune from eminent domain or condemnation? Quick, short answer to that is no, it does not. What it does do is, my hope would be that it would deter it, but it can't prevent it. And what I tell landowners are that if somebody approaches you that's wanting to exercise their right to eminent domain or condemnation, first thing to do is let them know, hey, the property is protected with a conservation easement because we're trying to protect the conservation values. Secondly, because time is usually a consideration for the entity that's wanting to execute those or exercise those rights, then I tell the landowner, tell them, hey, we're not going to voluntarily just give it to you. So we're going to end up in court. It's going to take a while. And also, it's kind of bad PR for your organization to want to come across a property that's being protected. So again, it won't prevent it, but hopefully it might deter it. Also get asked, are the easements ever terminated? Answer to that is, for the most part, no. But occasionally, a very rare occasion, given the right scenario and the right court, then quite possibly it could be. But by and far, these easements are not terminated. Again, they are perpetual. So conservation easement is just one of many tools in the conservation easement toolbox. And for me, it's my favorite. I think it provides the most return for the investment because they are a permanent protection for that property to ensure that it's always in agriculture and wildlife versus any other type of conservation measure you would want to apply, if it's brush control or seeding or even water improvement. Those have a lifespan. And a lot of those, particularly brush control and seeding, they require good management, or 5-10 years from down the road, you're back in the same position you were before you applied that conservation practice. So again, it's one of many tools in the conservation toolbox. It's not for everybody, but for those that the opportunity lines up with what the goals and objectives are, then to me, by far, it is one of the best, if not the best, conservation measure in that toolbox. So I'm going to pause right here, and I'm going to ask Andy to pick it up and let Andy move forward with kind of the purpose of the conservation easement and then also the steps that are required from start to finish to get it closed.
Good deal. Yeah, thanks, Darren. take it from here. Um, so yeah, you kind of briefly touched on this purpose of conservation easements early on, but I think we can kind of dive a little deeper on this slide. Um, First and foremost, usually the one that's always going to be included is that first bullet point there, protection of significant natural and ecological resources. And whether that's either a purchased easement or a donated easement, and we'll kind of get into that here in a minute, a little more details, but usually there's going to be some protection or some benefit to conserve some natural or ecological feature. There could also be historical features, and this could be maybe there's an old historical house, or maybe there's a historical um, something that's been on the ranch that could be associated with some kind of historical value. And occasionally there's some specific value that a landowner has that is very specific to that individual property. And so we will try to address that in the easement itself as well as other documents. One other thing to note is that, as Darren has mentioned, we really try to look at agricultural conservation easements. And one other item that we're going to really try to protect is that viability and the productivity of those working lands, while also protecting those natural and ecological values. And so that's one of the things that our goal is to keep those working lands working. Darren, you go next. So what are the benefits of conservation easements? And there are a number of them. And what we'll find is the benefits, some landowners may be able to benefit from some, but not all. Some landowners may be able to benefit from each of these items. And so they may choose to do an easement because of just one or maybe more than one of these little topics here. But the first thing that an easement does is that it's going to bind that current landowner's good intentions to that land forever. And so, wanting to keep that land as is and in working condition and providing habitat or whatever those values are that the landowner is wanting to protect, it's going to ensure that those are there in perpetuity. The next benefit for a lot of landowners, and Darren kind of touched on this one earlier, is it's going to help to maintain that family legacy. It's going to help to be able to keep that ranch or property together and be able to help pass it down from one generation to the next. It's also going to help protect the production and conservation values of that land, but at the same time, it's going to help eliminate any risk of fragmentation or any kind of non-agricultural use. There are some really good income tax deductions. The IRS treats a conservation easement as a charitable donation. And so as we get into maybe what the value of some of these conservation easements may be worth, they can be very, very valuable, which would lead to some really significant benefits from an income tax perspective. There is also an estate tax relief, right? So on an appraisal, the appraisal is going to show you what the value of that conservation easement is. And if, depending on your situation, in the estate situation, if this could be benefit to help eliminate estate tax to get under maybe that estate tax threshold, if that property is, you can reduce the value of that property on paper. The next one's probably one that it's kind of interesting to me, but I see it almost every time. And that's, if you haven't thought about what's going to happen with kind of the family and succession planning in your family, doing a conservation easement is almost going to force that to happen. Not in every case, but in a lot of cases, we kind of see that occur, where maybe the heirs, maybe it's the next generation starts asking questions, and they kind of work through that process, and everybody kind of gets on board with the conservation easement. But also, it relieves that pressure on the heirs. They know what's going to happen. They're not going to have to be worried about, so many years down the road, the current generation passes on, and okay, now what are we going to do? What's going to happen? This is going to help facilitate those conversations and probably relieve a lot of stress on those heirs in the future. Because at least at the end of the day, they're going to know this place is going to be protected, and if they choose to do something with it, how it will be dealt with. If as we get into purchase conservation easements, there could be some pretty good financial benefits from those easements when kind of those make sense for the landowner. So we'll touch on those just a little bit more in the next few slides. There. So yeah, so let's talk about the difference between a purchase conservation easement and a donated easement. And you're going to hear those terms quite frequently, kind of throughout the rest of the event today, but also as you kind of do your research, you'll kind of see those two discussions or those two topics. A donated easement is kind of the one that's maybe the most straightforward. It is essentially when that landowner is going to donate that easement, and it's going to be governed by IRS regulations. And if anybody wants to go and read section 170 of the IRS tax code, it's about the size of a ream of paper, several hundred pages. But that is ultimately the kind of the governing body. It kind of dictates what is and is not allowed within an easement. On the purchased easements, this would be where there's likely going to be maybe a third party funder included, and they would likely have additional terms on top of IRS regulations that they would want included in that particular easement. So different funders have different requirements, and there's some different funding sources out there that I think Colin will kind of touch on in a little while. But this would be, in most cases in Texas, we have very few fully funded easements. Most of them that we do have as purchased easements are usually only partially funded, which leads to what we would call a bargain sale easement, which is kind of a combination of the two, where a landowner would get some purchase, some of that easement purchased, but then the remaining value of that easement would actually be considered a donation back to the IRS. So usually the IRS is going to be involved in more often than not. Okay. So let's go into a little more detail on kind of the tax incentives. Back in 2015, they passed some new legislation at that time. So now we're kind of approaching this 10-year time frame here. But essentially, if we have a value of the easement, which in a lot of cases could be anywhere between, say, 30 and 50 or 60% of the market value of a property. And so that could be pretty significant value, depending on the size of your property. But if more than 50% of the income from your income, I guess, is from agriculture, then you can actually deduct up to 100% of your annual gross income. If 50% or less of your income is derived from agriculture, then you can only deduct up to 50% of that annual gross income, which in either case could still be worth, a significant amount of money. The interesting thing about this is that you actually have the year that you put the easement into on the property, and then you have 15 additional years to utilize that tax deduction. And so just in a real short example, right? If the value of the easement is worth $1 million, then you would have 16 years to actually utilize that $1 million tax deduction. So it could be very beneficial to a lot of folks in a lot of cases. One quick note, I say all that, we are not tax advisors, we're not CPAs, and we strongly advise, kind of every landowner when they get to this situation, and really kind of as you're thinking about it, as a landowner, it's good to kind of bring that CPA into these discussions very early on. They can kind of do their research and see how these tax incentives can actually benefit your particular situation, because it's going to be different for everyone, and kind of how that takes place. So we kind of bring this slide up here to kind of say, hey, look, CPA probably needs to be involved, and if you're thinking about doing something, it's probably worth having at least a general conversation with them on how it would benefit you moving forward. Darren. So this slide makes it seem like it's easy as 1, 2, 3. Just knock out a conservation easement. What I'll add to that is step number 3 has a lot of sub steps that we will get into shortly. But in general, it's not difficult to do a conservation easement. They do tend to take some time, but this is how they would kind of initially start. Once you kind of picked out a land trust that you wanted to work with, then there's likely going to be an application from that land trust. TALT has a landowner application that we would send the landowner. They would fill that out to the best of their abilities. There is no pass, fail, grade, or anything on that application. It's more of just kind of do your best, give us the information that you can. A lot of that information is going to help us understand what your intentions are with the property, and then kind of how we can go about moving forward. Step 2 is very important. We need to determine that type of easement that you want to do, and what meets your landowner objectives. So is that a donated easement and you can take advantage of those tax deductions? Is it some kind of a bargain sale situation where we can try to find some funding for a purchase easement? And then once we determine that and either move forward with a donated easement or move forward once we have funding, then there are a number of due diligence steps that we will start to move forward with. And so a lot of these are going to look pretty familiar if you've done any kind of real estate work or had any kind of real estate transactions recently. Since it is a real estate transaction, there's going to be a title commitment, there's going to be title review, and really looking at the title documents, making sure that there's not any significant encumbrances that would create a red flag, making sure that the owner of the property is who we think it is, making sure the deeds are clean, and ownership is who we all think it is. The conservation easement deed itself, just as Darren mentioned earlier, it's a pretty significant document that's probably anywhere from 45 to 55 pages long, depending on what goes into that document for each landowner. But working through those terms and figuring out what works best for that particular landowner and that particular property is going to be a pretty good amount of work. There'll be an appraisal completed, just like any other land transaction. There'll be a survey done. In a lot of cases, if it's a donated easement and we have a kind of a recent survey or a good legal description, sometimes that's not necessarily needed. A title insurance policy, just like a real estate transaction. And then the final two, the baseline report and the mineral report, are two documents that are maybe a little different from a regular real estate transaction. A baseline report is when we would have someone come out to the property and they're actually going to document the current kind of the current way that the property is set up. So they're going to identify all the fences and roads. They're going to identify any kind of infrastructure that currently exists on the property. They're going to look at those conservation values that we've identified for that particular property, whether that's wildlife values or agricultural values. And they're going to put all that into a big report. And essentially that baseline will now kind of dictate what occurs in the easement later on. And so we'll know if there's a new house that's built in the future or a new condo that shows up. We'll know that, hey, that wasn't there because the baseline is going to show what was here at closing. And then, were things done according to the easement terms. The mineral report is something that we do usually have to get some kind of due diligence work on. When the landowner owns the minerals, this becomes a pretty easy situation. As we know in Texas, the current owner and the mineral owner are in a lot of cases not the same person. And so we try to figure out, do we know who those mineral owners are? And then we also try to identify if there's any potential for minerals. And so in a lot of cases in Texas, if there's no mineral potential, we do what we call a mineral remoteness report, where we have a geologist, look at that property and give us an idea of, hey, look, there's probably not any minerals to be had. And that kind of alleviates some concerns. If there is a potential for minerals and mineral development, then we need to address those in the easement. And so that can be done in a number of ways within the deed terms. but it's something that we do have to kind of address and make sure that the easement meets those requirements for any kind of subsurface mining in the future. And so oil and gas development actually this is a question we get all the time, is does it prevent oil and gas development? These easements don't have to prevent development from occurring. We just need to make sure they occur in a conservation minded kind of way if possible. So Darren, so kind of going into the easement document itself, right? Kind of tailoring that conservation easement to each landowner. The process is essentially going to be the same for the donated versus purchased easements. What I will say though is that a purchased easement is likely going to have kind of maybe some additional third-party requirements in some cases, and so some of those terms that they have maybe aren't as negotiable or freely changed, whereas when there's not, that third party included, things can be a little more flexible. Our goal is to address those landowners' objectives while also meeting the land trust mission, but then staying within kind of the IRS guideline or the third, or that part, the fundraiser, the funders guidelines. And so the IRS kind of acts like kind of the lines on a road. They give you some flexibility. We've just got to do our job to stay in between them. We're going to determine what kind of reserved rights, what kind of, are there a reason for a future partition associated with the property? Does there need to be additional building envelopes? Are there existing building envelopes? All of those items kind of work through that easement document and figure out what's needed for that particular property. And then that easement's going to be executed and filed in the real estate records of that county. And so just as any other real estate transaction, it is a public document that gets filed at the courthouse and will be there forever. So purchased easements, just a few additional things here. I did talk about this a little bit. A purchased easement will also kind of address the funder's requirements. One example that we have here is maybe where we get a significant amount of our funding is from the USDA. The Natural Resources Conservation Service has some funding for conservation easements. They actually have a set of what they call minimum deed terms. And while these are kind of required terms that really can't be negotiated, what I will say is that for the most part, they're what they call agricultural land easements. So their program's called the ALE program. And so most of those deed terms align fairly closely with what our easement already shows. So there's not too many, there's not too many differences, I guess. And I would say that for most of the funders that we kind of go to, they kind of align with what were our goals and objectives already. There are other funders out there that, don't make as much sense because they require more restrictions. And so those don't really go well with ours, and we don't use some funders very often. And then Darren, if you'll go to the next slide, the one thing to kind of mention associated with a purchased easement is the length of time to get one closed. In a standard donated easement, I would say 5 or 6 months we can usually have a project started to finish. Can they be done a little faster? Yes, they can be done. When times are occasionally it does kind of take some additional work to make it happen a little faster, but they can happen. And we have some donated easements that do take a little longer as the landowner doesn't get in a rush, or maybe is trying to time up when that easement closes based on maybe an income event or some kind of life event that's occurring. When it comes to a third party funder being involved on a purchased easement, that usually means additional review times, additional requests, and additional folks that are going through the application process, going through the obligation of funding, reviewing all the documents and having them approve everything. And it's not uncommon, I would say, to have something take 18 to 24 months to get a purchase easement completed, depending on who the funder is. So just kind of keep that in mind. Sometimes these things can take a little while from the application process to the time when money starts to flow a little bit. So I think I'll leave that there, Darren. Kind of after closing, this is something that a lot of people don't really think about or consider, but it's probably maybe the most important or one of the most important aspects for taught in particular. And so after closing, the first thing is that landowner is going to make sure and work with that that CPA or the tax advisor that they've got on hand to make sure that things are handled correctly. There are a few documents that need to be filled out when you file your taxes. Talt will need to sign off on those, acknowledging that we are holding the easement. And so you'll want to make sure that all that goes smoothly. The easement holder is now responsible for conducting what we call the stewardship of that easement. And so a major portion of that is the annual monitoring. And in our easement, we basically require that the land trust has to go out to that property and physically see that property at least once a year. Occasionally it could be twice, but for the most part, it's a once a year deal. From Tall's perspective, that's a great opportunity for us to kind of work with that landowner. Are there ways that we can identify how to help? Is there things that there are other things that we can do to help that landowner? At the same time, we can verify that there's no new condos and hotels that have been put on the property, and that everybody is following the easement as they intended. Since these easements are perpetual and forever, our thoughts are, this is now kind of a working relationship, and maybe if you think of it as a marriage to an extent, it's a marriage that you can't get a divorce from in most cases. And so we see this as an opportunity to kind of work together, and we can be a resource for that landowner, and we're here to help. So something to keep in mind. And I think Talk does probably something, a lot of that in terms of one of the things that we're constantly thinking of is how can we be there for that landowner and create new opportunities for them. So this one, Darren, is or it's pretty much a repeat of where I started, but I'll just kind of summarize. Right, we know there's income tax deductions. We know there's estate tax relief. Succession planning. And it's also going to protect those properties' conservation values. And obviously, on a purchased easement, right, converting equity to cash could be an important benefit for some landowners that may need it. And so this is kind of the same slide that we started with, but I think it's good to just touch on it one more time, and then we can go to the next slide. So this slide talks about the potential drawbacks. And so there's not, in my mind, there's not a lot of drawbacks, but I think it's something that we try to cover and be upfront and honest with. Probably one that we deal with in a lot of cases is the high transaction costs in some cases. And so these completing a conservation easement from start to finish is not a cheap endeavor, right? There's going to be appraisals, there's going to be reports, there's going to be surveys, there's going to be attorneys' costs, there's going to be stewardship costs, all associated with these projects. And so some, title policies on very valuable properties could be, thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars. And so the transaction costs can be something to keep in mind, and could be something that we have to kind of work through. There are limited funding for purchased easements. We've talked about purchase projects, but in reality, Texas NRCS normally gets around $4 to $5 million annually. $4 to $5 million sounds really good until you realize that some of these properties may have an easement value that are worth several $1,000,000, and so there could be only 2 or 3 or 4 projects that get funded each year in Texas with those funds. And I believe this last funding cycle, I think they had over 50 applications. So it's a pretty competitive process. We're hopeful that there are more opportunities that come through. Texas Parks and Wildlife will be another one, and there's several others I guess we'll get into here in future slides. The sale of the easement is subject to capital gains. So got to kind of keep that in mind. And once again, that's probably a CPA question and how that would affect you. The tax benefits generally are only going to be available for that first generation. And that's something that we really kind of look at and look to. And one of the reasons why we try to spend a lot of time looking for other opportunities for our landowners, because this is a great tool. As Darren mentioned, it's one of his favorite tools, but once it's utilized, it's kind of a done deal. And the benefits for those next generations may not be there. Use of the property is limited for the future. It cannot be developed into ranchettes or neighborhoods or something similar. And so that could be seen as a drawback, might be seen as a benefit, depending on how you look at things. And then the value of that property on paper is reduced by the value of the conservation easement. And I'm going to put on here again, I'm going to say it again, on paper, that value is reduced. In reality, I'm not sure. We're starting to see some of these properties change hands over time, and I think we will see more as more easements, get completed across the state. But one of the things I think we've seen over time in the few transactions where these properties have changed hands is the value of that property was not really reflected in the sale price. It was almost, if you'd have told me that that property had an easement, I might not have believed you if I didn't know it. Just looking at the sales process. And so that's something that's kind of interesting to see over time, that maybe we could see a situation where maybe something with conservation easement actually is seen as a positive and not as a negative for future landowners. So we'll kind of see how that goes. There's limited, I guess, data points at this time, but something to keep in mind in the future anyway. So, Darren, you can go to the next one.
All right. Thank you, Andy. We're going to pick up where you left off, and I'm asked Colin to take some time and kind of go through some of the funding opportunities that we look at. Some of them were mentioned, but I'll let Colin go through and talk about them in a little more detail.
All right. Yeah, the best part for last, right? You can't
You
spell
betcha.
funding without fun. So, as Andy and Darren both probably mentioned, are on a purchased or a bargain sale type easement acquisition, our primary funding source comes through the USDA, NRCS, and so they have the program. The government loves acronyms. We call it, you hear it called ACEP, ALE. It's the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program. Under that umbrella, you have the Ag Lands Easement, ALE, and the Wetland Reserve Easement. We don't deal with the Wetland Reserve easements. Those are government held easements on help protect and restore wetlands. So we'll just be talking about the ALE. It's a farm bill program, and so the nationwide funding for this program, $450 million, seems like a lot. Of course, that'll sometimes vary from year to year. You got to remember, out of that $450 million, there's also the WRE program gets some, and each state is allocated a certain amount. As Andy alluded to, say Texas gets $5 million, it can go pretty fast. As with any farm bill program, participants have to meet FSA, Farm Service Agency, eligibility for farm bill programs, including AGI and some other requirements. So you have to have records with Farm Service Agency to participate in this program. And like most other farm bill programs, it's a competitive application, competitive ranking process. So we help the landowners apply, and they're ranked against however many other applications around the state. So it can be difficult to get approved, depending on ranking and funding availability. We can go on to the next, Darren. Another option for USDA is the another acronym, right? Regional Conservation Partnership Program. So both the Ag Lands Easement and the wetlands are available through this program. You still have to have farm bill eligibility, and they're competitively ranked. The difference is with RCPP, they are a entity will put in for this program, as a project lead, and they will designate a certain area. So typically a watershed or a geographic area within the state. And if they get approved, then they have a certain amount of money to spend on conservation easements in that particular area. So that is a little more beneficial because we can, instead of competing statewide, we can take applications within a certain geographic area and spend the money only within that area. So it's a similar process. However, it is a smaller, less competition often in these. It's just getting those approved. The specific project areas approved, those compete nationally. So some examples of ones that are actively approved in Texas. TALT actually has a couple of them. We're the lead partner on the Nueces and the Texas Coastal Prairie RCPP project areas. But as you can see, there are a few others as well. And this is the conversation we have with landowners if they're looking for a funded easement. Well, we'll always see where they're located if they fit one of these project areas as well. So go on. So I think Andy had also mentioned through the state the Texas Farm and Ranch Lands Conservation Program. So it's state-led, state funded. However, it's only $2 million. Has been approved in the last 3 legislative sessions. We can combine that with the federal funds as well in certain situations. It doesn't preclude you from getting an ASAP funded easement as well. We would love to see that dollar amount grow, especially with the pressure, as Darren mentioned, that Texas sees on losing our ag lands. So it's again a ranking process. So we're subject to ranking out high enough to get funded on that program as well. Go ahead. There you go. And local or resource specific funding. There's some examples of some areas where it's a municipality or a county or some other jurisdiction that can actually set aside money to try to help protect our open space, ag, and wildlife lands. And these vary around the state. Some of them fit, some of them don't, and that's one of our jobs at TALT is what we do is again, if we have an interested landowner, find out where their ranch is located and always look to see if any of these will fit them as well. So I think Andy might have mentioned we do have some private donors, private philanthropic organizations that are looking to put some money into great organizations and great great goals to preserve working lands. And so we're always looking and talking with foundations that align with our objectives, right? They're not all going to be a good fit, but ideally we would love to see more of these come into play and not have to rely so heavily on USDA funding. But yeah, that's we're always looking and always in conversations with private donors as well to help try to fund some of these easements, or at least help some of the due diligence costs, right? The transaction costs that have been mentioned. If we can help alleviate some of that on the landowner and help them protect their land, that's definitely a goal of ours here at TALT.
I think that covers the funding part of it through this information in here. So you could feel free to reach out to any of us. This is our land team that works on the conservation easement acquisition. The 3 of us, and then Hannah Blankenship is our stewardship manager. Then we also have 4 what we refer to as regional stewards, and these folks are scattered across the state. You can see we got one on the Gulf Coast, Panhandle, Trans-Pecos, and then one in the South Central regional area. So sometimes it's it's just a little more comfortable to talk to somebody that's within your region rather than talking to somebody across the other side of the state. However, feel free to reach out to any one of us, and any of us could be more than happy to help you with that. And then one thing just to kind of share, just to acknowledge some of our supporting partners that help with today's webinar. We've got them up there for you. And then for the most part, that concludes with what we wanted to present, but we wanted to make sure we were finishing up with enough time that I think now we can do some question and answers, and try to help you all with getting you the information that you need to be able to make an informed decision. So, Emma, do you want to read off questions, or how do you want to handle this?
I'd also say, Darren, if there's anybody got a question, if they raise their hand or something, we can click on. I don't know if
Yeah,
that works or not, Casey, but I have tried to address several questions. I can I'll take a stab at a few of these, Darren, that I've been trying to
sure.
uh, address in the comment section. There was one comment by Lori about the use of maybe a purchased easement funds to be used as a 1031. And so that is the case in instances where there is a purchased easement. Um, it's a real estate transaction, so those are treated as real estate funds, and we have had landowners in the past who have been able to take those funds, put them into a 1031 exchange, and expand their current operation, maybe by uh, buying out a neighbor or other properties, and so that can be beneficial if those kind of plans or if those ideas fall into your plans. Um, the one note that I did mention over here, there was a note about putting a portion of your property into an easement. But I thought I'd expand my answer just a little bit more. Uh, you can put in a portion of the property. I brought up the issue of making sure there's legal access. And so that's actually a case for whether you put the whole property in or a portion of the property. We've got to have legal access. But in a lot of those instances where somebody wants to put in a portion of the property and they don't put in property, that's got road frontage, we may need to make sure there's a legal access easement put in place. If you're wanting to put in your whole entire property and you don't have legal access, that's something you'll want to take care of before we get too far down the road too. Dan, you want to take that one? Or
Let me see. I just saw it pop up.
so
How do you
just
enforce
enforcing
the
the easement?
violation terms of the easement? Okay, so when a conservation easement closes, the responsibility for that stewardship and enforcement falls on the deed holder. In this case, would be the land trust. And we do everything we can ahead of time to avoid these kind of situations. And this land trust has been very successful at doing that. But occasionally something could happen where usually what happens, it's a subsequent landowner that has either purchased or inherited the property, may or may not understood what was in that conservation easement, and did something that they really didn't have the right to do anymore. And so that annual visit to do the monitoring, um, that's typically when those situations are identified. And then we work with the landowner to take care of that, to come up with resolution to um, fix whatever that potential violation is. And I think what you're probably asking me is, okay, worst case scenario, then, what happens? How do you enforce that? Well, obviously, if it came to it, hope it would never come to that. But if we end up where we just can't come up with a resolution that satisfies the conservation easement, then we would end up in court to take care of that. Good question. You want to get that one, Andy?
Yeah. So with properties varying drastically, what are the few key factors that are consistent in most purchased easements? Uh, so yeah, it depends on really from a purchased easement. I'll kind of take a stab at it from that perspective, because when we look at purchased easements, they're going to be. Let's take NRCS and let's take their program for example. They're going to essentially go through a ranking process, and they're going to identify based on those values and what's there, how they kind of rank out. So some of those questions, Reed, are going to be associated with the property itself. And so some of that's going to look at whether or not there are prime farmland soils, if there are creeks, named tributaries that are going through the property. Those are, be some items that you would get points for. Sometimes, or some of the other questions really we don't have any say on, really don't have a lot of ability to I guess make adjustments to. But some of those questions will be around population, and so they're going to look at things on a county level. They're going to look at the average parcel size within that county. They're going to look at the loss of agricultural lands within that county. They're going to look at the population growth within that area. So when you're looking at NRCS funds on a statewide level, there's some counties, we'll say Williamson County, north of Austin, obviously is much under a much higher threat of development relative to, some, Loving County out in far west Texas, that has no development. And so they're going to take those and kind of rank those properties within those respective counties would be ranked accordingly. And so some of it's not necessarily anything the landowner or the land trust can do. They're just going to be kind of ranked out based on those particular features. But yeah, there's probably I don't know, there's probably 15 or 20 questions that NRCS has. Now, some other funders have different goals and objectives, and so a Parks and Wildlife grant, their questions look a little different than an NRCS application. Some of the private funders, they may be focused on certain objectives, and so a private funder may focus on grassland birds or shoreline birds, um, and they may, that may be what they're trying to focus on. Other funders may focus on the threat of renewables, solar farms and wind farms and things like that. So it's kind of varies from funder to funder what they're looking for. NRCS is our biggest one, and so that's one that we kind of does bring in those populated areas, and then water and soils, and soil productivity are probably your three main topics.
And to piggyback on that, Andy, so when we talk about that RCPP, the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, where there's a little more direction from the project lead on that, we can kind of come up with our own priorities somewhat. They have to be approved by NRCS, but within that geographic area for an RCPP project, we can have priority and ranking questions and ranking points that differ a little bit from the statewide NRCS funding. So they're all a little bit different.
We have a question on here about mineral leases and how they relate to a conservation easement. Colin, you want to take that one?
Yeah. So a lot of it, well, we're looking to protect the conservation values. Number one, that's the reason we're putting the easement in place, right? So the difference will come whether it's a donated easement and it's TALT trying to determine what best to do or what we need from an oil company or our leaseholder, I guess, to make sure that the conservation values aren't affected. And so that can be through a surface use agreement type document. Surface waiver in some instances, if we can get the oil company to agree to it, just to make sure that we're not putting an oil pad every 40 acres across the ranch, right? When we have a funder involved, another example of like with NRCS funding, it's a little different. It might be a little more difficult to negotiate just because NRCS and they have it all has to be approved by them for the funded portion. But Mineral activity, it's not eliminated, or having mineral activity does not preclude you from having a conservation easement. It's just one more step in that due diligence process where we have to have an agreement in place to protect the conservation values of the farm or ranch that the easement's there to protect.
Okay. Another question. Is there a minimum or maximum acreage for a conservation easement? The answer to that is no, but it depends on the land trust as far as what their guiding principles are regarding the size. So each one is different. I can speak for Talt because, again, we are agriculture minded and we want to and keep working lands working. Um, our board looks at kind of a threshold for a minimum as being 140 acres. And then anything above that in the thousands of acres, obviously we're good with that. But for us, 140 is a minimum, with exception of if a property is below that threshold, but that exhibits significant conservation values, then the board would take that into consideration. All right, question. Has there been any work on easements to reserve water rights for freshwater inflows to bays and estuaries? Andy, you want to talk about that? Maybe because, we've had some easements there on the coast.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to take this, and I may take this in another direction and punt it to Colin in a minute on different water issues. Yeah, I mean, when it comes to reserving water rights for freshwater inflows, I mean, TALT hasn't addressed that specific objective, I guess, as far as I know. Even some of the older ones, I don't think really that was not their main objective or focus, I don't think. Um, I mean, I know that there's other land trusts also that are down there on the coast that maybe focus a little bit differently on the bays and estuaries. But where I would go to is kind of throw this a curveball here, and I think Colin should talk a little bit about groundwater reservations, maybe up in the Panhandle. And that is an area where we are working on some water right issues.
Yeah, so we're helping a fairly new land trust in New Mexico, kind of on the Ogallala Aquifer, and they are basically they're trying to put conservation easements to restrict irrigation and groundwater use in an area. Obviously, everybody knows Ogallala's diminishing, and so they're working specifically with some areas with some farmers to basically give up their groundwater rights moving forward and go to permanent grass or dry land if you can in certain situations. But it's definitely something that's going to become more of an issue even into Texas and even off of the Ogallala, the whole water rights issue. I'm sure we're going to see more and more of it as we move forward. But yeah, we haven't, the freshwater inflows is going to be a benefit of one of our conservation easements for the most part either way. But like Andy said, we don't know that we've ever identified that as a specific goal. But I'm sure there are land trusts that have addressed that issue.
If they haven't addressed it yet, it's another topic that's going to be water in general, right? Becoming a bigger issue every day, and so yeah, there's no doubt that surface water as well as groundwater are going to be hot topics, and probably using conservation easements to address those concerns will be part of it for sure. There's one for you, Darren.
Okay, yeah. And so the question is, can a conservation easement and wetland easements overlap? They cannot overlap, but they could be adjacent to. So a good scenario would be a property that is determined eligible by NRCS for a wetland easement. Maybe the entire property is not eligible, so a landowner could choose to put part of that into the wetland reserve easement and then the remaining part into the ag land easement, or it could be a donated easement for that as well. But no, as far as having two on the same, you can't do that. You're basically duplicating the protection that you already have. Now, one thing to keep in mind, if you're not familiar with NRCS's ASEP program, the wetland reserve easement is a much more restrictive uh, conservation easement, and it's a lot easier to think of that bundle of sticks. It's kind of reversed. Instead of you holding the bundle of sticks and giving a few of them away, it's a lot easier to think of the opposite, handing that whole bundle of sticks to NRCS and them handing you back 5 or 6 of them. So it is a lot different. It's much more restrictive. But if you're looking for a purchased easement, the financial benefit is greater on that. Can a purchased easement occur on a property with an active loan, or does property need to be 100% paid off? Let me do one more and then I'll get Andy or Colin on the next one. No, it does not have to be completely paid off. It is acceptable for property to have a lien on it. What happens is we go through what's called a subordination process, where the lender, working with the landowner, agrees to allow subordination. So there is a document, a subordination agreement. Most cases, I don't know that we've ever had a problem with a lender not being willing to agree to that subordination. And usually, probably one of 3 things happens. Either one, they say, no, we're not going to do it, the lender. Or number 2, they might say, yes, we're going to do it, but if it's a purchased easement in particular, they may say, well, we want part of the proceeds that the surface estate is owner is receiving to pay down the note. Or thirdly, they may just say, there's enough equity in it, we'll just go ahead and sign off on it. But yeah, the short answer is a lien against the property is not a problem. Let's see, next question. How valuable would a native grass ranch in Dallam County be with demonstrated large but undeveloped irrigation water to be in an easement? Okay, I'm gonna pick on Andy because Andy also wears a second hat. He's a realtor and he understands fair market values and that kind of thing. And so Andy, I'm gonna let you answer that one.
Yes, I'll tell you. Well, I'm going to be. I mean, I'll give him the answer that he was looking for, Jeff. But I think we can come up with an answer. I need probably a few more data points in terms of size of the property, location, road frontage, things like that would go into maybe the value. And there's some appraisers on here too that would probably say there's more than a few other things, a few of those things. But in general, Jeff, the way to kind of take the value of a conservation easement, kind of explain that process, and this might help you kind of put some numbers in your head. They're going to look at the market value of the property as it stands today, and as if you were to put it on the market and sell it, tomorrow, what is the value of that property as is? They are then going to look at with the encumbered easement on the property, and with those items that you're putting on there, which on ours primarily the ability not to develop that property or subdivide in the future, as well as limiting the options for solar, commercial solar and wind development. They're going to then reduce the value of what are you giving up. And what I would tell you is that across the state, that's easement, the value of the easement relative to the value of the market value of the property tends to be anywhere from say 30 to 60%. 60% occurring maybe 30 miles outside of Dallas, heavy potential for development. More maybe there's a lot of threats over there. Western Texas, you're probably looking at somewhere closer where the threat of development is less. You're probably looking at say 30%, maybe 35% of that market value. Ultimately, they could all vary a little bit. I don't think I've ever seen a 50 in West Texas, and I've never seen a 30 in East Texas. So there's going to be kind of a gradient across the state from west to east becoming more valuable. And so I don't know what land's going for in Dallam County, but I could sure look it up and kind of come up with some ideas and get you in the ballpark, Jeff. If you send us an email or give me your number or something here at the end, I can do some more digging for you when we're done.
And to kind of go on top of that, Andy, you know, what people, I guess if it helps paint that or continue painting that picture you got, is the more of those sticks that they're giving up, the more that change in value, the more restrictive the easement, in other words. So if you're no partitions, no building envelopes, maybe you're going to say no future irrigation, then that's going to further change that value from before to after the encumbrance of the easement, right? So that goes into effect. There's a lot of things, of course, you know, the appraisers, that's a gross oversimplification of the process, but the more rights, more sticks you give up, the more change in value typically.
Yeah, that's good. Also see your comment, Jeff, about farm credit, and we have done several, and farm credit has been very cooperative when the landowner requested the subordination.
I think there's any more questions?
Yeah, other questions?
This is Quincy Ellis. I just have a comment to thank you. It's been very informative, and I really appreciate your time. And you guys have done a wonderful job. Thank you.
Thank you, Quincy. Appreciate it. We enjoy what we do.
I'll follow up with you shortly, Jeff.
My understanding is that, and I think Casey's on here, that the link to the recording will be sent out. Is that right, Casey?
That's correct. As soon as it finishes uploading.
Okay, great. So I know some of you might have stepped away and had something else and might have missed part of it. You'll have that opportunity to catch up. And then also, if you want to share it with others, feel free to do that as well. I'm ask one last time, going once, going twice. Anybody have any other questions or comments? Thank you. Well, we really appreciate y'all getting on today, and moving forward, if there's anything that we can do, by all means, reach out to us, and any one of us on that list can be more than happy to help you. But with that, I think we'll conclude, Casey, and appreciate everybody.